The second phone call came just as the first one stopped echoing in my ears. I remember the clock ticking, the hum of the refrigerator, the stillness of my house wrapping around me like a warning. Patricia's voice was warm, almost kind, as she thanked me for being so understanding about my health problems. If you've ever had your stomach drop before your heart could catch up, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. This one's for you. In that single breath, I realized it wasn't the trip that was canceled. It was me. And from that quiet disbelief, something inside me began to shift. Let me show you how it all began. It was a little past 7:15 p.m. when I realized I had become the quietest person at the table. The restaurant was one of those New York places where the lighting is low. The glasses shine like crystal chandeliers, and the laughter feels rehearsed. I sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, pretending to be a modest retired teacher from upstate, smiling at all the right moments while my son's fiancée's parents took turns filling the air with talk of ski resorts, business connections, and their daughter's bright future. I could feel the weight of their judgment without a single word being said. The way Mrs. Reynolds glanced at my cardigan, too simple, too soft, or how Mr. Reynolds leaned back with that polite, practiced smile that said more than it should. In their world, people like me existed only to applaud others' success, and so I did. Quietly, gracefully, because that was the role I had chosen to play. I remember the chill of the water glass in my hand, the scent of truffle butter in the air, the sound of my son laughing a little too loudly, trying to keep the conversation smooth, to protect me from their subtle condescension. I said very little that night. I didn't need to. People like the Reynoldses loved the sound of their own certainty, and I let them have it. What they didn't know, what no one at that table could have guessed, was that I could have bought the restaurant we were sitting in twice. That the modest woman before them had built her fortune from nothing, managed an empire, and walked away from it all without ever needing to prove her worth. But that night wasn't about proving anything. It was about my son, about the life he was stepping into, and the family that would soon surround him. I told myself to stay small, to smile, to blend in. It wasn't easy. Every dismissive glance, every polite smirk felt like a test of patience I hadn't studied for. Still, I kept my calm. I always do, because when you've lived long enough, you learn that the truth doesn't need to be shouted to be powerful. It just needs to wait for the right moment to be seen. And that moment was coming sooner than they ever expected. There was a time in my life when success filled every corner of our home. My husband, Charles, built his insurance company from a small office above a bakery in Savannah into something that people in the industry quietly admired. Steady, reliable, and deeply personal. He was the kind of man who remembered every client's name, who wrote thank you notes by hand, and who believed that character mattered more than ambition. I used to joke that he was in the business of trust more than insurance. When Charles passed, it felt like the air changed. The house was too big, the silence too heavy. I spent months walking through rooms filled with his presence, his books, his handwriting, the faint smell of cedar from his suits. There's no manual for losing someone who built your entire world with you. Eventually, I made the decision he would have wanted to sell the company. The offer came from a larger firm, and though it was generous, more than I ever imagined we'd see, it felt strange accepting money for something that carried our history. After that, I left the corporate circles, the fundraisers, The quiet competition among women who measured themselves in handbags and vacation homes. I moved to Charleston and bought a small cottage near the marshes, where the mornings smell like salt and magnolia, and the evenings stretch long and peaceful. I started volunteering at a local school. The children called me Mrs. Hayes with that innocent affection that somehow healed parts of me I didn't know were still broken. Ethan, my son, took after his father. Steady, thoughtful, unwilling to let comfort make him complacent. He went into law, not because of money, but because he believed in fairness. I admired that about him, even when it meant watching him struggle through long hours and small paychecks at the beginning. I never wanted him to live under the shadow of what we'd built, only to carry the values that made it possible. Then, one evening, he called. There was a lightness in his voice I hadn't heard in years. He told me about Claire, smart, charming, from a well-known family. He wanted me to meet them. That night, I stood in front of my closet longer than usual. I looked at the designer dresses still wrapped in garment bags, the pearls that hadn't seen daylight in years. Then I reached for a simple cardigan instead. It wasn't about hiding who I was. It was about understanding who they were. And as I packed my overnight bag for New York, I couldn't help but feel a quiet curiosity beneath my calm. Sometimes, the only way to see a person's true nature is to let them underestimate you first. The car dropped me off in front of a restaurant that glowed like a jewelry box. The windows shimmered with gold light, and through the glass, I could see tables dressed in white linen, waiters gliding like shadows, and people who had mastered the art of appearing effortlessly superior. I remember pausing at the door for a moment, steadying myself before walking in. I told myself to breathe, to stay small, to let the evening unfold exactly as planned. Ethan was already there, handsome, nervous, with the polite stiffness that told me he'd been trying too hard. And then there they were, the Reynoldses. Victoria, with her immaculate blonde hair and pearl earrings that probably cost more than most people's rent. Douglas, tall and distinguished, his smile the kind that was rehearsed in boardrooms. And Claire, sweet, polite, beautiful in that polished way that said she'd been raised to charm and to win. The hostess led me to the table, and I felt their eyes sweep over me before I even sat down. My sweater, my simple necklace, the handbag I'd had for years, none of it passed their unspoken test. Still, I smiled. That's what women of my generation were taught to do. From the start, the conversation felt like a performance. They asked about Charleston as if it were an exhibit, about my teaching career with that delicate tone people use when they're trying to sound kind, but can't hide their pity. I talked about the school, the children, the joy of small things. But every time I spoke, I could sense Victoria's polite smile tighten just slightly, as though my words were proof of a quiet failure. Douglas went on about markets and mergers, about who he knew, and who his daughter would soon be marrying into. He said it casually, but there was a quiet edge to it, as if to remind me that people like them didn't need to pretend. I listened, nodding when appropriate, tracing the stem of my wine glass to keep my hands still. Ethan tried to bridge the distance. Bless him. I could see the effort in his eyes. The way he jumped in with little comments meant to make things easier. But every time he did, Douglas gently corrected him, turning it into a subtle lesson about how the world really works. And my son, my kind, idealistic son, just smiled and took it. That hurt more than anything else. At one point, Victoria leaned forward, her voice soft and perfectly pleasant, and asked about my pension. My pension, as if my entire life could be summarized by a monthly deposit. I remember feeling a kind of calm rise inside me. Not anger, not yet, but something firmer. A realization that I was sitting across from people who saw value only in appearances, who mistook quiet for weakness and humility for lack of worth. The waiter brought dessert, something delicate and overcomplicated. I couldn't taste it. I was too busy watching them, the way Claire looked between her parents for approval before she spoke. The way Douglas held his fork like a weapon of conversation. The way Victoria examined every word as though it were a brand label. There was a moment, near the end of the evening, when I felt an almost physical ache in my chest. Not from what they said, but from what they didn't. From the way they dismissed me with politeness so smooth it could cut glass. And in that silence, I realized something profound. They didn't know me at all. They didn't know about the years Charles and I spent building a company from nothing. They didn't know about the nights I worked late balancing budgets, the risks I took, the millions I quietly walked away with when I sold it all. They didn't know that every bite of their expensive meal could have been bought 10 times over by the woman they'd just underestimated. So I smiled again. Not out of pretense this time, but out of quiet amusement. I let them finish their wine, their smug assumptions, their performance of superiority. And when we finally stood to leave, I thanked them for a lovely evening, and meant it. Because that dinner gave me something priceless clarity. As I stepped outside into the cool Manhattan air, I could still hear their laughter fading behind me. I remember thinking, with a calm that almost surprised me, they have no idea who they just judged. And that was the moment I knew. Sooner or later, they would. The evening should have ended there. Polite goodbyes, another round of empty compliments, and a cab ride that would carry me back to quiet anonymity. But fate, I've learned, has an impeccable sense of timing. The waiter had just cleared the dessert plates, and Douglas was in the middle of a story about some new investment firm, when a voice from across the room called out. It was warm, familiar, the kind of tone that cuts through the polite noise of a crowded place. I looked up and saw the chef walking toward our table, his white jacket spotless, his expression full of genuine delight. For a moment, I couldn't place him. Then he stopped beside me, his face lit with recognition, and suddenly I did. Years ago, when Charles's company was still in its prime, we'd approved an emergency loan for a young restaurant owner in trouble. I remember reading his letter back then, earnest, desperate, full of dreams. He'd built this place from nothing, and it was about to collapse after a fire. Charles had said yes to the loan before I could even finish the report. Now, here he was, smiling down at me with that same sincerity. He thanked me, not quietly, but with a voice full of gratitude that carried farther than he probably intended. He spoke of how the company I once helped run had saved his restaurant, how it gave him a second chance, how he would never forget it. And just like that, the entire table froze. I felt the air shift before I even looked up. The Reynolds' polished composure cracked just slightly. Victoria's smile faltered. Douglas blinked, uncertain whether to stand or stay seated. Even Claire, dear sweet Claire, stared as if she were seeing me for the first time. Ethan looked at me in disbelief, a mix of pride, confusion, and the dawning realization of who his mother really was. The chef thanked me again and excused himself, leaving behind a silence that rang louder than any insult ever could. I took a sip of my wine, letting the moment breathe. No one spoke. I could almost hear the wheels turning in Douglas's head, trying to reconcile the woman in the plain cardigan with the one who had once held the power to change a man's future. It would have been easy to gloat, to enjoy the reversal, to meet their stunned eyes with something sharp. But I didn't. I've lived long enough to know that true dignity doesn't need an audience. So I simply smiled, softly, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside, though, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not because they knew now, but because I no longer cared whether they did. The rest of the dinner unfolded like a play where everyone had forgotten their lines. Victoria's tone turned syrupy with sudden admiration. Douglas began asking about my past ventures with forced enthusiasm. Even Claire tried to bridge the gap with kind words that came a little too late. I answered their questions politely, my voice calm and measured, but I could see the unease in their eyes. Respect, I thought, given too late, feels hollow. As we stood to leave, I glanced around the restaurant one last time. The chandeliers, the fine china, the soft hum of conversations continuing as if nothing had happened. I thought about how easily people assign worth, how fragile their perceptions become when status enters the room. That night, walking out into the cool Manhattan air, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even vindicated. I was simply aware of how people reveal themselves not when they meet wealth, but when they think they're above it. And the Reynoldses, in their perfect clothes and polished voices, had revealed more than they ever intended. The city felt quieter that night. Even the sound of traffic outside my hotel window seemed muted, as if New York itself had decided to take a breath. I sat by the window, the lights from passing cars painting soft streaks across the glass, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The dinner had been everything I expected, and more. There was a quiet satisfaction in seeing truth surface without force, but also a sadness that lingered, the kind that comes when pride and cruelty reveal themselves in people you had hoped might be better. I wasn't angry. I was tired. The kind of tired that lives deep in your bones, where emotions and memory tangle together. I thought of Ethan, of how uncomfortable he had looked at that table, how torn he had been between love and loyalty. I knew that expression too well. I'd worn it myself, once upon a time, in boardrooms where kindness was mistaken for weakness. It was close to midnight when he knocked on my door. I didn't need to see his face to know what he was feeling. Shame, guilt, confusion. He stood there for a long moment, struggling to speak, but he didn't have to. I could feel every word he couldn't find. I invited him in, and for a while, we just sat in silence. That, I think, is something only mothers and sons can do. Communicate through the quiet. He finally began to tell me how sorry he was, how blind he'd been, how embarrassed he felt by the way Claire's parents had treated me, and by his own hesitation to step in. His words came out haltingly, like something breaking open. I listened, not to judge, but to understand. That's what mothers do when they see their child learning something painful. They hold the space, even when it hurts. I told him it wasn't a trick, what I'd done. I hadn't dressed modestly to deceive anyone. I wanted to see who they were when there was nothing to gain. Because character isn't revealed when people meet your wealth. It's revealed when they think you have none. He nodded, eyes downcast, and I felt his heart break more than I heard it. He admitted he'd been ready to propose, but now he wasn't sure. He said he couldn't stop replaying that dinner in his head. The tone, the looks, the silence. I wanted to protect him, the way I always had. But there are truths even a mother can't soften. Love can be blinding. And sometimes, the most painful thing about seeing clearly is realizing who stood in the shadows beside you. When he left that night, he hugged me tighter than he had in years. I felt his heart beat against mine, strong, uncertain, human. I told him he didn't owe me an apology. The world will always test us, I said. The lesson is in how we respond. After he left, I stayed awake, listening to the faint hum of the city. There was peace in knowing the truth had surfaced. But beneath that peace, something uneasy stirred. A faint intuition that the night's revelations had only begun to ripple outward. Some storms don't pass quietly. Some linger, waiting for dawn. For a few days after the dinner, there was silence. That strange kind of quiet that feels too deliberate, too heavy. Ethan and I barely spoke. I wanted to give him space to think. I spent my mornings tending to the small garden behind my Charleston house, trimming rosemary and hydrangeas, letting the ocean air soften the edges of my thoughts. I wanted to believe the whole ordeal had ended, that humiliation, revelation, and forgiveness had already played their parts. But peace, I've learned, rarely lasts when pride is wounded. The first call came 3 days later. Victoria Reynolds, her tone dripping with grace. She wanted to clear the air, she said. She spoke as if nothing truly unpleasant had happened, as if cruelty could be undone by manners. I listened, quietly. Beneath her polished words, there was something brittle, desperation wrapped in charm. She mentioned Ethan often, her phrasing careful, her compliments too deliberate. I recognized the pattern immediately. I'd spent decades reading people like her across boardroom tables. They always called it reconciliation, when what they really wanted was control. After her came Douglas. His voicemail was full of forced sincerity, apologies crafted for optics rather than conscience. He spoke about misunderstandings, about how emotions sometimes get the better of people. But every apology carried a faint undertone, a reminder that he was well connected, that Ethan's legal career could thrive or struggle depending on how things unfolded. He didn't have to say more. Threats rarely arrive in complete sentences. By the end of the week, my phone became a theater of false remorse. Messages from Claire, two, small, nervous ones that read like assignments handed down by her mother. I deleted most of them, but the tension stayed. It seeped into my mornings, followed me through my quiet afternoons. Something in me knew this wasn't over. Then, one afternoon, she arrived. I saw her car pull into the driveway, sleek, black, the kind of car that makes an entrance even when it pretends not to. I could have ignored the knock, but I didn't. Some things have to be faced. Victoria Reynolds stood at my door, dressed in soft beige, pearls glinting faintly in the Charleston sunlight. She smiled the way people do when they're about to say something unpleasant, but want to look kind while doing it. I invited her in, out of politeness more than hospitality. She walked through my home slowly, eyes scanning the simple furniture, the worn books, the photographs. She made small talk about the ocean view, about how peaceful it must be to live away from all the noise. but every word was laced with something sharper. Eventually, she turned the conversation to Ethan, to his future, his career trajectory. She mentioned Douglas's firm, his connections in the city, the fragile nature of professional reputations. And in that moment, it wasn't what she said that chilled me. It was how she said it, with the same tone she might use to discuss weather. I remember looking at her and realizing that for people like the Reynoldses, power wasn't just currency. It was oxygen. And the thought of losing control over the narrative suffocated them. I stayed calm. I always do. I thanked her for visiting, walked her to the door, and wished her a safe flight home. She left smiling, convinced she'd planted her warning effectively. But she didn't see what I felt behind my stillness. A slow, deliberate shift from patience to resolve. When the sound of her car faded down the road, I stood there in the doorway for a long while. The late afternoon light spilled across the floor, and I realized I was done waiting for peace to return. This wasn't about civility anymore. It was about protection. And I would protect my son, not with anger, but with strategy. There comes a moment in every storm when the wind changes direction, when you stop bracing against it and begin steering through it. That moment came for me the morning after Victoria Reynolds left my doorstep. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat by the window overlooking the marsh, and felt the weight of something shift inside me. I was done waiting for decency, done giving the benefit of the doubt to people who thrived on illusion. It wasn't anger that moved me. It was clarity. For most of my life, I'd let others mistake my quiet for weakness. I learned long ago that power doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to know when to act. So, I decided to act. I started with a single phone call to an old friend from my husband's business days, a man whose discretion had never failed me. I didn't have to explain much. He knew the type. Within a few days, the information arrived. It was simple, clean, devastating. The Reynolds' empire was built on sand, a web of loans, leveraged properties, and mounting debt disguised as success. Their real wealth wasn't money. It was perception. And perception, I knew, could be undone with one well-timed truth. Reading those numbers, those desperate balance sheets, I felt no joy, only a deep, steady satisfaction. The universe has a way of restoring balance to those who have patience. The Reynoldses had shown me who they were, and now I saw what they were built on. I spent the next few days crafting my response, not in words, but in tone. Every gesture, every sentence would matter. I would not confront them with rage or righteousness. That's what they would expect, an emotional woman reacting to insult. Instead, I would offer them what they understood best: opportunity. I sent an invitation, polite, formal, handwritten. I invited Victoria and Douglas Reynolds to Charleston to discuss a potential investment collaboration, a project that could benefit both families. The language was deliberate, professional. It gave them exactly what their pride demanded: a chance to regain dignity, or at least to pretend to. But beneath that politeness lay the quiet architecture of my plan. I wanted them close, in my space, where charm couldn't hide desperation. I wanted them to look me in the eye and see the difference between pretense and power. As I sealed the envelope, I felt calm, an almost meditative kind of calm. This wasn't revenge. It was alignment, a final rebalancing of truth. I thought of Ethan, of how fiercely I wanted to protect him. Not just from the Reynoldses, but from the illusion that decency and weakness were the same thing. He didn't need to fight this battle. I already knew how it would end. By the time the letter left my hand, the game had shifted. They just didn't know it yet. True strength, I've learned, isn't in the strike. It's in the silence before it. The stillness of someone who already knows where the fault lines lie. It was a warm Charleston afternoon, the kind that carried the scent of salt and jasmine through open windows. The harbor shimmered in the distance, calm and bright, as if mocking the tension that hovered beneath the surface of the day. I'd chosen a small cafe near the waterfront for our meeting, neutral ground, public enough to discourage theatrics, private enough for truth. When the Reynoldses arrived, they were precisely as I expected, overdressed for the weather, smiles polished to perfection, their confidence restored by the illusion that they were in control again. They greeted me with exaggerated warmth, the kind reserved for people they think they can charm. I let them. Sometimes silence is the most effective introduction. I ordered tea, not out of habit but ritual. The slow pour, the curl of steam, the patience it demanded. It grounded me. As they began speaking about opportunities, about forgiveness and mutual benefit, I simply watched. I've learned that people reveal the most when they believe they're leading the conversation. Then came the moment. I waited for the right pause, the breath between arrogance and assurance, and gently placed a small folder on the table. Inside were copies of their company's latest filings, partnership documents, and a few discreetly obtained reports from a firm that owed me a favor. I spoke calmly, describing what the papers already showed: the loans, the unpaid creditors, the quiet panic hidden beneath layers of reputation. The change in their faces was subtle but unmistakable. The color drained from Douglas's cheeks first. Victoria's smile froze mid-sentence. The kind of paralysis that comes only when the world tilts and you realize it's your own hand that set it spinning. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply told them that I understood, that sometimes people get trapped by the very image they build to survive. I explained that I wasn't interested in revenge or exposure, but I would not allow them to harm my son or continue pretending their cruelty was sophistication. I told them that their choices had consequences, not from me, but from truth itself. They could rebuild quietly, with humility, or continue pretending until the facade collapsed on its own. Either way, my silence would not be bought with fear. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the faint clink of china from another table and the hum of conversation in the distance filled the air. Then, slowly, they gathered their things, the arrogance gone, replaced by something closer to awe, or perhaps shame. They thanked me, though we all knew it wasn't gratitude, but relief that I hadn't destroyed them completely. When they left, I sat there a while longer, watching the sunlight ripple across the harbor. There was no triumph in me, no thrill of conquest, only a deep, still peace. Justice, I've learned, doesn't roar. It settles quietly, like dust after a storm. I thought of Ethan then, of his kind heart, his belief in fairness, his future unshackled from deceit. I wanted him to know that integrity doesn't always win quickly, but it always wins cleanly. As I finished my tea, a soft breeze swept through the open door, carrying the scent of the sea. The city felt lighter. The weight was gone. The truth had done what it always does. It had set things right, in its own quiet, unwavering way. The days that followed were unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for attention. It just exists. The air in Charleston felt lighter, as if the tide had carried something heavy out to sea. For the first time in weeks, I woke without that faint ache behind my ribs. Justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't make noise. It just settles. Ethan came by a few evenings after it all ended. We didn't talk much about the Reynoldses. There was nothing left to say. He looked at me differently, though, not with pity or guilt, but with understanding. The kind that only comes after truth has burned away illusion. We sat on the porch watching the sun melt into the marsh, and in that silence, I felt everything words could never capture. Forgiveness, love, and a shared sense of peace. In the stillness, I thought about everything that had happened, how pride can blind people, how fear makes them cruel, and how power, when misused, always collapses under its own weight. But more than that, I thought about the difference between revenge and resolution. Revenge leaves you empty. Resolution leaves you free. I didn't win anything in the traditional sense. There were no headlines, no applause, just a quiet correction, a realignment of what was right. The Reynoldses had learned something they might never admit out loud, that wealth without integrity is just another form of poverty. And I had learned something, too, that strength isn't always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's the calmest one. Ethan and I have dinner together more often now. He helps me in the garden. I listen to him talk about cases at work. We've stopped trying to protect each other from discomfort and started sharing it instead. That, I think, is what peace really looks like. Not perfection, but honesty held gently between two people who choose to keep trying. As I sit here now, watching the water catch the last light of day, I realize that life isn't about avoiding storms. It's about learning how to stand still in the rain without losing yourself. So, if you've ever been underestimated, manipulated, or made to feel small, remember this: your quiet strength is not weakness. It's the beginning of wisdom. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stay composed long enough for the truth to reveal itself. Have you ever faced something like this, where silence spoke louder than anger? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.